My name is Eleanor Hayes. I'm 68 years old. A widow. And for most of my life, people have mistaken my silence for weakness. They thought I was just a quiet woman who spent her years cooking dinners, folding laundry, and depending on everyone else. But they never asked who I used to be before I became somebody's wife and somebody's mother. They never wondered what I was capable of if pushed too far. The day I walked into that courtroom, my own daughter laughed at me, and her husband whispered something they'd regret for the rest of their lives. That was the moment they forgot one thing about me: I don't break easily. You can call it pride, or justice, or maybe just a mother's patience finally running out. But that day, they were about to learn who they were really dealing with. They laughed when I walked into the courtroom that morning. I heard it clear as day. That sharp little snicker, cutting through the rustle of papers and the hum of voices. My daughter Patricia sat there in her neat gray suit, her blonde hair tied tight like she was auditioning for perfection. Beside her, Michael leaned in close and whispered something that made her smile in that smug way I knew too well. The way people smile when they think they've already won. I kept walking. My shoes made that steady tap against the marble floor. A sound that used to calm me back when I spent my life in courtrooms like this one. Now it just echoed, lonely and soft, almost lost beneath their laughter. I held my old leather bag close. The same one I'd carried for years. Edges worn. Zipper stubborn. A few people glanced up as I passed, probably wondering why an old woman was walking in alone without a lawyer. At my age, people expect you to fade quietly, to let others handle the hard things. They see the wrinkles, the careful steps, the simple clothes, and they think frail. They think finished. Patricia thought that too. I could see it in her eyes the moment they landed on me. That mix of pity and disdain that only a daughter can manage. When I reached the defense table, I set my bag down, smoothed my skirt, and looked around. The courtroom was smaller than I remembered. Maybe because the ceilings weren't as high as they used to be in my day. Or maybe because time shrinks everything except memory. Across the aisle, Michael leaned toward Patricia again. He said something low, but his voice carried anyway. She probably doesn't even remember her own name. Patricia laughed, covered her mouth like a child caught doing something wrong. But she didn't look sorry. I straightened my back and met her eyes. For a second, she looked startled. Then her smirk returned. That hurt more than I cared to admit. It wasn't the insult. Not really. It was realizing that the girl I'd carried, the one I'd stayed up nights for when she had nightmares, the same child I once walked to school, holding hands, had grown into someone who could laugh at me in public. Someone cleared their throat near the bench, and the bailiff called the room to order. All rise. Everyone stood as the door opened, and then she walked in. Judge Margaret O'Connor. Her hair was silver now. Shorter. Sharper. She moved with the same deliberate calm she'd had 40 years ago when I last saw her. For a second, she froze. Our eyes met. Her step faltered just slightly. Enough that I knew she remembered. I gave the smallest nod. Nothing more. It wasn't the time. Not yet. When she sat, the room followed. The scrape of chairs echoed. I lowered myself carefully, every muscle aware that they were watching. They wanted to see weakness. That was the story they'd written about me, the confused widow who didn't understand money or law or life without her husband. I folded my hands on the table and breathed slowly. My heart wasn't racing, but my stomach twisted. I hadn't been in a courtroom since before Patricia was born. I used to feel powerful here. Now, I felt something else. Anticipation. Michael whispered to Patricia again, and she looked at me, then laughed under her breath. Her voice was soft but sharp enough to cut. Poor old woman. She'll lose everything today. That one landed. For a second, my hand tightened around the handle of my bag. I could almost feel Richard's presence beside me. His steady warmth. That reassuring smile he'd give me before every hard thing. If he were here, he'd whisper, "Let them laugh. Ellie, they'll stop soon enough." The judge shuffled her papers and looked up. Her voice carried easily. "Court is now in session for the matter of Patricia Miller and Michael Miller versus Eleanor Hayes." My name echoed off the walls. I kept my gaze on Margaret. She didn't look at me directly, but her jaw tightened just a fraction. As the introductions began, Morrison, their attorney, stood and launched into his opening statement, all smooth confidence and pitying tone. He described me as a grieving widow confused by her husband's complex estate, manipulated by outside influences, incapable of handling finances. I didn't interrupt. I wanted to hear the whole performance. My eyes drifted toward Patricia. She nodded occasionally, as if she believed every word. I wondered if she ever stopped to think about what she was doing, or if Michael had convinced her that betrayal was practicality. When the statement ended, the judge glanced my way. "Mrs. Hayes, do you have counsel today?" I stood. "No, Your Honor. I'll be representing myself." A ripple moved through the room. I could feel Michael's smirk even without looking. The old woman defending herself. A disaster waiting to happen. Let them think that. It was exactly what I wanted. I sat again, folded my hands, and let the silence stretch. The kind of silence that makes people nervous. Margaret watched me a moment longer. Something like understanding flickering across her face. Then she continued with the procedure. As Morrison began laying out their so-called evidence, I drifted back for a moment. Back to the smell of the kitchen, the morning I opened that summons. The sharp bite of coffee gone cold. The sound of Patricia's voice on the phone, pretending to care. That's where this really began. But that story could wait. Right now. In this room, I needed to stay exactly who they thought I was, a tired old woman clutching an outdated bag. I needed them relaxed, overconfident, because the truth, the real truth about who I was and what I knew, would come later. And when it did, that smirk on Patricia's face and the whisper from Michael would be the last things they'd ever laugh about. The judge's voice brought me back. "Mrs. Hayes, are you ready to proceed?" I smiled politely. "Always, Your Honor." Across the aisle, Michael leaned back, still smiling, still so sure of himself. Patricia crossed her legs and whispered something again, eyes flicking toward me. I didn't bother listening this time. I already knew the pattern. Mockery now, regret later. Margaret tapped her pen once against the desk, the way she used to when she was thinking. Her eyes met mine again, and for the briefest moment, there, it was a flash of recognition, curiosity, and maybe respect. The sound of that gavel striking wood cut through the air. Case proceedings begin. I adjusted my glasses, drew in a slow breath, and thought, let's begin indeed. Outside, the gray Boston morning pressed against the windows, and somewhere far above the noise and judgment and pride, I imagined Richard smiling. They had no idea what was coming. 6 months earlier, I was sitting beside Richard's hospital bed, holding his hand while the machines hummed softly in the background. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and something sterile that never quite left my clothes. Outside, snow had started to fall against the Boston skyline. Richard's skin was pale but warm, his grip weaker each day. When he opened his eyes, they still held that steady look that used to quiet entire boardrooms. "Ellie," he whispered, using that nickname no one else ever dared to. "When I'm gone, they'll come for you. You know that." Right, I tried to smile. "Don't talk like that. I'm serious. They think you don't understand the business. They think I've sheltered you. I've made sure you're protected. Everything is yours. Just like we agreed." He was talking slowly, the way people do when every word costs them. I wanted to argue. to tell him I didn't want to talk about wills or money. But deep down, I knew he was right. Patricia had married Michael 2 years after college. And from that day on, she stopped visiting, except for holidays. Richard used to say, Michael saw numbers where normal people saw people. I squeezed his hand. You worry too much. His smile was faint, tired, full of love and warning. Just promise me one thing. Don't let them make you feel small. When the heart monitor started to slow, I kissed his forehead and whispered that I would be fine. I wasn't sure if he heard. 2 weeks later, we gathered in the office of his lawyer, Mr. Levin, a man Richard had worked with for over 20 years. The office was sleek, full of glass and polished wood. Patricia sat beside Michael, dressed in black, face carefully arranged into grief. She'd brought tissues, a detail that felt rehearsed. Mr. Levin cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and began reading. To my beloved wife, Eleanor Hayes, I leave my entire estate, including all business assets, accounts, and properties, currently valued at approximately $58 million. The air in the room seemed to stop moving. Patricia's hand froze mid-gesture. The tissue fell to the floor. She turned to Mr. Levin. That can't be right. I sat still, eyes fixed on the city skyline through the window. I already knew what it said. I had read it months before, when Richard insisted I review every page. Patricia's voice rose, sharp and panicked. Daddy promised me the Cape House. He said I'd take over Hayes Development someday. Mr. Levin looked at her kindly but firm. Your father made his wishes very clear. Mrs. Miller. To you, he leaves his wristwatch and a family photo. Michael's jaw tightened. What about me, Mr. Levin turned another page. To my son-in-law, Michael Miller. I leave my golf clubs. It was almost comical, if it hadn't been so heartbreaking. Patricia's face changed in front of me, from confusion to rage in the space of a heartbeat. This is insane, she said. Mom doesn't know how to manage all that money. She'll lose it within a year. Michael leaned forward, voice clipped. We need to see those documents. There must be a mistake. There's no mistake, I said quietly. Richard planned this. He knew exactly what he was doing. Mr. 5. Levin nodded. Your husband updated his will several times over the past 5 years. Patricia turned to me, eyes narrowing. Why would he leave me nothing? Because he knew you'd always have everything you needed. I wanted to say. Instead, I simply stood, gathered my purse, and walked out. The snow outside had turned to slush, the kind that soaked through shoes and made the sidewalks treacherous. By the time I got home, Patricia and Michael were already waiting on my front porch. Patricia's mascara had smudged, her expression half fury, half fake sweetness. Mom, can we come in? I opened the door without a word. Inside, the air smelled like coffee and old books, the way Richard liked it. Patricia sat on the couch where she used to do homework, while Michael remained standing, scanning the room like he was assessing assets instead of memories. Mom, Patricia began. This is all a big misunderstanding. Daddy must have meant for you to let Michael handle the investments. He's good with finances. Michael nodded. All business. We could set up a trust. You'd have an allowance every month. You wouldn't have to worry about taxes or decisions. I poured tea slowly, letting the silence stretch until Michael shifted his weight. I appreciate the concern, I said, but I'm perfectly capable of managing my own affairs. Patricia's smile faltered. Are you? Though you've never even used online banking. I looked up at her. There are many things you don't know about me, dear. Michael set his cup down with a faint clink. We just want what's best for you. Mrs. Hayes. I met his gaze, and for a moment I saw what Richard had always seen in him. Ambition wrapped in charm, with greed just beneath the surface. When they finally left, I stood in the doorway, watching them walk down the steps. Patricia leaned on Michael's arm, talking quickly, her shoulders tight. I knew that posture. She was scheming. That night, I sat in Richard's old study, the one lined with law books that Patricia always thought were his. She never asked why they were in my name. On his desk, under the framed wedding photo, was a sealed envelope with my name in his handwriting. I opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a small card with just 2 words. Call Margaret. I remembered her instantly. Margaret O'Connor. Harvard Law. Class of 1982. Brilliant. Ruthless. Fair. We hadn't spoken in decades. But suddenly, I could hear Richard's voice again. When they come for you, you'll need someone who remembers who you were. The phone felt heavy in my hand. I didn't call that night. I just sat there staring at the city lights through the window, thinking about how easily love could turn into entitlement. A week later, a courier arrived at my door. He looked uncomfortable as he handed me a thick envelope. Inside were the legal papers for the lawsuit. My own daughter's name in print beside the words, "Petition for Conservatorship." I set the papers on the table and made myself a cup of coffee. Outside, the street was quiet, the kind of silence that only comes in winter mornings when even the wind seems to hesitate. I sat down, opened the first page, and read every word slowly. The way I used to dissect witness statements. They claimed I was unfit, forgetful, manipulated by unknown influences. They cited minor mistakes, like the time I got lost driving to Patricia's new house after she moved to Brookline, or when I asked her son to help me connect my TV to Wi-Fi. I laughed softly to myself. If forgetting a password made someone incompetent, half the city would be declared unfit. An hour later, the phone rang. Patricia again. Mom. Please don't take this personally. We just want to help. I looked out the window at the bare trees, swaying against the pale sky. Help me. Or help yourselves. Her tone hardened. Once the court appoints Michael as conservator, you'll still have your home. You won't have to deal with any of this stress. And where will you live? There was a pause. Well, the Boston townhouse is larger. Better for family gatherings. You'd be more comfortable at the Cape House. Of course. The small house for the old woman. The big one for the young couple. I see. I said. Mom, you're being unreasonable. You married Daddy when you were 25. You never had a career. You don't understand finance. I almost smiled. Background, she said. Like I'd been a blank slate before Richard. After we hung up, I went back to the study. The clock ticked softly in the quiet room. I ran my fingers along the spines of the law books, some with my name written inside in faded ink. They were old friends, waiting patiently for me to remember who I was. I pulled one from the shelf, opened it, and began to read. The words came back like muscle memory. Every clause, every precedent, every strategy I'd once lived by. By the time I closed the book, the fear had settled into something else. Purpose. Patricia thought she'd found a fragile old woman to defeat in court. She didn't realize she'd woken up the lawyer who used to win cases just by letting the other side underestimate her. The snow outside had started again, soft and relentless. I stood by the window, watching it coat the streets white. Somewhere, Richard would be smiling. They thought they were taking my life apart. What they didn't know was that they'd just given me a reason to fight again. The morning after the snow finally melted, a thick envelope slid through my mail slot and hit the hardwood floor with a sound that seemed louder than it should have been. I stood staring at it for a long moment, coffee in one hand, feeling that small weight like a verdict already given. The return address said Suffolk County Probate Court. I set my mug down and picked up the envelope. The paper felt heavier than normal. Expensive. Official. My fingers didn't shake. Not really. But my stomach tightened the way it used to before closing arguments. I carried it to the kitchen table and sat down. The light coming through the window was pale and cold, catching the gold rim of Richard's wedding photo that still sat in the corner. The first page had Patricia's signature, neat and deliberate. Below it were words that made my throat dry. Petition for conservatorship of Eleanor Hayes. My own daughter wanted a court to decide that I was incapable of managing my life. I read every page slowly, line by line, the way I used to examine witness statements for contradictions. They'd hired a top law firm in Boston. The language was careful but cutting. Words like cognitive decline, impaired decision-making, financial risk. There were exhibits listed. Things I hadn't realized they'd even noticed. A receipt from the time I drove to Patricia's new house in Brookline and got lost because of construction detours. A text message where I asked my grandson to help me set up Netflix. Even a note from the bank clerk mentioning that I'd double-checked a withdrawal amount. They had twisted normal moments into proof of incompetence. Halfway through, I started to laugh softly. Not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. If being cautious and asking for help meant I was unfit. Half the women in my book club would need court supervision. The phone rang just as I reached the last page. Patricia's number. I let it ring twice before picking up. "Mom," she said, her voice honey-sweet and hollow. "I'm so sorry you had to find out this way. Are you—" "Patricia, we tried to talk to you reasonably, but you wouldn't listen. You're making risky choices. We just want to protect you." "Protect me," I repeated quietly. "That's what you call this." Her tone changed. Sharper now. "Once the court appoints Michael as conservator, you'll still have everything you need. You'll have a nice allowance, and we'll take care of all the complicated business matters." I stared at the window. A cardinal had landed on the bird feeder Richard built years ago. He used to say cardinals brought good luck. And where would I live? Exactly. Under this new arrangement there was a pause. The kind that gives away more than words. "Well, you'd be more comfortable at the Cape House. It's smaller, easier to manage. We'd stay in the Boston townhouse. It just makes sense." "Of course it does," I said. "For you." "Mom, please, don't make this harder. You married Dad when you were 25. You never had a career. You don't understand business or law or money management." Something in me went very still. Patricia had no idea how wrong she was. She'd lived her whole life, assuming her father handled everything, never once asking how the contracts were drafted or who managed the tax strategies. "I see," I said. "And Michael, he's good with money." She hesitated, caught off guard. "He has experience." I wanted to laugh but didn't. Experience spending other people's money. "Maybe we'll talk in court," I said, and hung up. For a while I just sat there listening to the hum of the refrigerator. Then I stood, walked down the hall to Richard's old study, and turned on the small desk lamp. The shelves lined with leather-bound law books glowed softly under the yellow light. Patricia had always assumed they were Richard's trophies. She never looked close enough to see my name printed on the spines. I sat down, opened the top drawer, and pulled out the thick manila folder where I kept old certificates and papers I hadn't looked at in years. My Massachusetts bar card was still there. Expired but not forgotten. The number was familiar even after all this time. I flipped through my notes from the last case I ever took. A fraud defense from 1989. The handwriting was mine, firm and decisive. I could almost hear my younger self arguing before a judge, making logic out of chaos. That muscle memory stirred like an old song I hadn't heard in decades. The next morning, I called Mr. Levin. He answered with that same calm tone. "Mrs. Hayes, I heard about the petition." "Of course you did," I said. You probably got served before I did. He hesitated. They're moving quickly. I thought you might want representation. Not yet. I said. There's someone I need to speak to first. I hung up and looked at Richard's note again. Call Margaret O'Connor. I still remembered her office number from 30 years ago. Funny how memory works. It forgets the grocery list, but holds on to the things that matter. I dialed, half expecting a receptionist to tell me she'd retired. Instead, a brisk voice answered. Judge O'Connor's chambers. This is Eleanor Hayes. I need to speak with Margaret about a case coming before her court. There was a long pause. Then a voice I hadn't heard in decades came through. Warm with disbelief. Eleanor, my God. Is it really you? It's me. Margaret. Another pause. Softer this time. Your daughter's suing you. Isn't she? That's right. She sighed. I saw the name on the docket and wondered if it was you. Eleanor. You can't be serious about representing yourself. I smiled even though she couldn't see it. You always did underestimate me. Her laugh was small, almost fond. Some things never change. Tell me, do you still argue with that quiet confidence that drives everyone crazy? I guess we'll find out. We talked for a while. Both careful. Both remembering without saying too much. When I hung up, the house felt less heavy. Later that afternoon, I decided to visit Patricia one more time before this war began. Maybe, just maybe, I could make her understand what she was doing. Her house in Brookline was big and modern. All glass and chrome. No warmth anywhere. She opened the door, wearing an expression that said she wasn't happy to see me. Mom. What a surprise. Michael's at work. Good. I said. This conversation should be between mother and daughter. She led me to the living room. I accepted the coffee she offered, though my hand stayed around the cup mostly for warmth. Patricia. We need to talk about this lawsuit. She set her cup down too hard. There's nothing to discuss. You're not well. Mom. This is for your own good. I'm not sick. Patricia. I'm grieving. But I'm not incompetent. She looked frustrated. Yesterday, you called me asking how to transfer money between accounts. Last week, you couldn't figure out the online bill pay. These aren't normal mistakes. I studied her face. When did you become so sure you knew everything? She crossed her arms. Someone has to handle things. What if I told you? I said quietly. That I've been pretending. She blinked. Pretending what? Pretending to be helpless. Pretending to need help with things I understand perfectly. For a heartbeat, she looked unsure. Then shook her head. That doesn't make sense. Why would you do that? Because people treat you differently when they think you're weak. They tell you things they wouldn't tell someone they see as a threat. She gave a short laugh. Mom, you're 68 years old. What kind of threat could you possibly be? I stood and smoothed my coat. The kind you're about to find out. Her mouth opened. But no words came. I paused at the doorway. Hand on the brass handle her father had chosen years ago. You've made a very serious mistake. Patricia. Mom. You're scaring me. This paranoid talk is exactly why we filed the petition. I turned back to her one last time. I love you. Patricia. I always will. But I won't let you or anyone else steal what your father worked for. Her eyes followed me as I left. A mix of confusion and anger. Outside, the air had that sharp chill of early spring. I felt something I hadn't in years. Not fear. Not sadness. Something closer to purpose. To power returning after a long sleep. They thought they were protecting me. What they were really doing was waking me up. That evening I found myself dialing a number I hadn't called in nearly 40 years. My hands didn't tremble this time. The ringtone clicked once. Twice. And then a woman's voice answered briskly. Judge O'Connor's chambers. This is Eleanor Hayes. I need to speak with Margaret. Tell her it's urgent. There was a pause. long enough for me to picture the young clerk on the other end, flipping through a mental Rolodex, unsure whether the name meant anything. Then another voice came through. Deeper, older, but still carrying that sharp, certain tone I remembered from law school. Eleanor. My God. It's really you. It's me. Margaret. I heard the faintest laugh. A sound that carried decades of memory. I saw your name on a case this week and thought it couldn't be the same person. I should have known better. She still had that mix of warmth and steel that used to make people nervous around her. We spoke briefly. Careful with our words. You can't expect me to recuse myself without cause, she said. But you also know I can't give you advice. I don't need advice, I said. I just need you to remember who I am. There was a small silence. I remember. How are you holding up? I've been better. But I'm not broken. She exhaled into the phone. That sounds like the woman who once made me rethink my entire opening argument. We both laughed then. Soft and quick. The kind of laughter that only old rivals share. Before we hung up, she hesitated. If you're planning to represent yourself, Eleanor, make sure you're ready. This isn't the courtroom we knew. Law has changed. So have I said. After I hung up, I stood by the kitchen window, watching the streetlights blink on. The air outside was still cold but different now. Charged. I wasn't just a widow anymore. I was something else again. The next morning, I met Margaret in person. We chose a small cafe near Government Center. One of those quiet places that looks ordinary enough to disappear into the city. She was already there, sitting by the window. Glasses perched low on her nose. Her hair was silver now, cut short. But her posture was exactly as I remembered. She looked up as I approached and smiled. Well, if it isn't the sharpest mind of Harvard Law. Class of '82. You always did have a good memory, I said. She gestured for me to sit. When the waitress came, we both ordered tea. It felt strange, sitting across from her after all these years. We used to spend nights in the library, arguing over case law until security turned out the lights. So, she began. Patricia's suing you. Yes. Her expression softened. I'm sorry. Eleanor, family cases are the worst kind. They are, I said, especially when your family forgets who you are. We sat in silence for a while. The kind that doesn't need filling. Then she leaned in slightly. You still have your license. Always. I renew it every few years. Old habits die hard. Margaret smiled. Impressed, but not surprised. So what's your plan? To let them think they're winning? Her eyes flickered with something like amusement. You always did love an ambush. Only when it's necessary. The door opened behind us, letting in a gust of wind. Margaret glanced at her watch. If I'm assigned to your case, I'll have to stay neutral. You understand that? Of course. I don't need favors. Just fairness. You'll get it. But Eleanor, be careful. They're using an attorney named James Morrison. He's competent. He's handled dozens of elder competency suits. He'll come prepared. I smiled. I hope so. She looked at me for a long moment, as if measuring the distance between the woman she used to know and the one sitting across from her now. Finally, she said quietly, You know, you haven't changed much. Maybe slower to move, but not slower to think. Flattery, from a judge, that must mean I'm really in trouble. She laughed, shaking her head. You're impossible. You always were. When I left the cafe, the city air felt alive around me. The snow had melted into thin gray streams running along the gutters, and people were hurrying past in coats and scarves. I walked slowly, enjoying the movement, feeling something loosen in my chest that had been tight for months. That afternoon, the local news ran a small financial segment about a real estate firm on the verge of collapse. Miller Investments, The name caught my eye before the reporter even said it. They spoke of missing funds, quiet layoffs, and a pending investigation by the SEC. I didn't smile, but I couldn't deny the satisfaction curling in my stomach. I spent the next few days in Richard's study, surrounded by the hum of the old desk lamp and the scent of dust and paper. Helen dropped by one evening with soup and gossip. She was the kind of friend who showed up without asking if she should. "I heard Patricia's been talking around town," she said. "Claims you've been confused lately. She mentioned something about a competency test." I stirred my tea slowly. "That's what they're hoping for." Helen frowned. "And you're just going to let them, for now?" "People tend to underestimate a woman who listens more than she talks." Helen gave me a look that was half concern, half admiration. "I remember when we used to study together. You'd sit there quiet for an hour, then stand up and destroy an argument in 5 sentences. That was a long time ago." I said. "Not as long as you think." She stayed for another hour, filling me in on neighborhood news, before hugging me goodnight. When the door closed behind her, I went back to the desk and opened a new notebook. Across the top of the first page, I wrote one word in careful letters: strategy. That night, I drafted questions for the hearing. The facts were clear. Patricia's case relied on portraying me as mentally incompetent, manipulated, and unable to manage finances. There was no medical evidence, no formal diagnosis, only assumptions. I would let them expose their arrogance piece by piece. By the time I looked up from the desk, the clock showed past midnight. I made myself another cup of tea and walked into the living room. The framed picture of Richard and me on our wedding day sat on the mantel. He was looking at me like he always had, like I was the only thing in the room worth focusing on. "You'd enjoy this, wouldn't you?" I said softly to the picture, watching me get back in the ring. The house creaked in reply. Before I went to bed, I checked the folder on the desk one last time. The evidence was lining up nicely, but something still felt unfinished. I stared at the headline on the newspaper beside the folder: "Miller Investments faces questions over missing funds." I didn't know it yet, but that story was about to become my greatest leverage. I turned off the lamp and let the room fade into darkness. The faint hum of the city outside, blending with the rhythm of my own heartbeat. For the first time since Richard's death, I felt alive again. Tomorrow I would begin preparing in earnest. Tonight, I allowed myself the small comfort of knowing that Margaret O'Connor remembered exactly who I was. The next morning I woke up before sunrise. The house was quiet, the kind of stillness that only comes before dawn. I made coffee and took it into the study. The stack of papers from the night before was still there, neat and waiting. I opened my notebook and began listing what I knew, what I could prove, and what I could make them reveal on their own. By 7, the first light crept through the curtains, landing on Richard's old briefcase in the corner. I pulled it closer, surprised by how heavy it still felt. Inside were contracts, old business records, and a few letters written in his precise handwriting. I ran my fingers along the edges of the papers, remembering how he used to bring this case home every Friday. Patricia would climb onto his lap, and he'd pretend to let her help with his work. A knock at the door pulled me back to the present. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened it, Helen stood there, holding a paper bag and wearing that look she always had when she came, bearing both food and unsolicited advice. "You haven't eaten, have you?" she said, pushing past me into the kitchen. "You're persistent," I told her, closing the door. "Persistent friends are better than hungry lawyers," she said. Unpacking bagels and 2 cups of coffee, she looked around at the open books and folders. "You're really doing this yourself, aren't you?" "I am." She shook her head, half impressed, half worried. "You could hire someone. You know, let them fight this for you. No one fights like a woman who has something to prove," I said. Helen laughed, but her eyes softened. You always were stubborn. She stayed for a while, reading quietly as I worked. Around 9, I got an email notification. Unknown sender. The subject line read, "I think you should see this." Attached was a scanned contract with a familiar signature at the bottom. Michael Miller. My breath caught as I read the details. It was a private investment agreement for a real estate project that didn't exist. The figures didn't match. He'd borrowed company funds through shell accounts. The sender's name was Sarah Kim. I remembered the name from the articles about Miller Investments. She had been an analyst there. The email said she left the company after noticing irregularities and was willing to share what she found. I read her message twice before replying. "Thank you. Please send whatever you have. I'll keep it confidential." Her response came within minutes. "I know what they're trying to do to you. You should know, Michael is desperate. He's been hiding losses for months." I printed everything and slid it into a red folder. Helen watched quietly. "What is that? Insurance?" I said. "For what? For when they realize they underestimated me." That afternoon I called Mr. Levin again. He sounded relieved to hear my voice. "Eleanor, I'm glad you called. The hearing date's been set for next month. They're moving faster than usual." "Good. I'd rather end this sooner." He hesitated. "They're confident. Morrison is already talking about a preliminary evaluation. Let them." I said. "The more they talk, the more they reveal." There was a pause. "You sound prepared." I smiled to myself. Preparation is the only thing that keeps people like us sane. After I hung up, I opened my old law textbooks again. The pages were yellowed, but the content was timeless. Case law on competency evaluations. Burden of proof. Witness credibility. I read for hours, jotting notes in the margins like I used to. That evening, the phone rang again. Sarah's voice on the other end was quiet but clear. "I wanted to make sure you got the files." "I did. Thank you." "Why are you helping me?" "Because I know what it's like to be treated like you don't matter," she said. "Michael fired me when I questioned him. He said no one would believe me anyway." I believed her instantly. There was something in her tone that reminded me of my younger self. Fighting to be heard in rooms full of men who thought silence meant ignorance. "You did the right thing," I said. She hesitated. "He's probably expecting you to settle. That's what people like him count on." Then he picked the wrong woman. When the call ended, I sat for a long time staring at the folder. It wasn't just leverage anymore. It was evidence of who they really were. 2 days later, I went downtown to the courthouse to file my response. The clerk, a young woman barely out of college, looked at me over her computer screen. "You're filing pro se, that's right." She glanced at the name on the petition and back at me. "Is this family?" "Yes." Her expression softened. "I'm sorry. These cases are tough." "I know. I used to handle them." Her eyebrows rose slightly. But she didn't ask. She stamped the papers and handed me the receipt. I walked out, feeling lighter. Like each step echoed something powerful. Outside, the wind had picked up, scattering old leaves across the courthouse steps. I tucked the red folder under my arm and headed toward the subway. On the platform, a newspaper headline caught my eye again. "SEC investigates Miller Investments." I didn't buy the paper, but I didn't have to. The headline alone was enough to remind me that time was on my side. That night, as I locked the front door, the phone rang again. Patricia's number. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won. "Mom," she said, her voice tight. "What are you doing?" Morrison told me. "You're representing yourself. That's insane." "I'm not insane, Patricia. I'm capable. There's a difference." She sighed, exasperated. "Why are you making this harder? We're giving you a chance to avoid embarrassment." "Embarrassment," I repeated slowly. "Is that what this is about? We're just trying to help." "You can't win this." Her certainty made me almost smile. I'll see you in court. Dear. I hung up before she could reply. For the first time in months, I slept deeply. When morning came, I brewed coffee, opened the red folder, and began organizing my evidence into sections. Dates, amounts, inconsistencies. Richard would have appreciated the precision. He always said justice isn't about anger. It's about patience. By noon, my notes covered the entire desk. I stopped only when the doorbell rang again. Helen returned, holding a folder of her own. I asked around. She said, placing it on the table. A friend of mine works at the state licensing board. Michael's firm has been flagged before. I met her eyes. This will do. Helen smiled. You look like you did before a trial. That's spark. Maybe I just needed a reason. I said. We shared a quiet moment before she left. After she was gone, I sat alone again, pen tapping lightly against the paper. Outside, the afternoon sun cut long shadows through the blinds. By the time I closed the notebook, everything was in order. The pieces were falling into place exactly as they should. They thought they were building a case against a confused widow. What they didn't realize was that I was building one of my own. And I'd learned long ago that the strongest arguments weren't shouted. They were the ones you saved until the moment they least expected them. 2 nights before the hearing, I decided to see Patricia one last time. I told myself it was to find closure. But part of me knew it was strategy. Sometimes it's easier to win a fight when you've already seen the fear in your opponent's eyes. The drive to Brookline took less than half an hour. The sky was gray. The kind that promised rain, but never quite delivered. Patricia's house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac lined with identical homes. All neat lawns and expensive silence. She'd redecorated again since my last visit. New lights. New stone steps. New everything. Her idea of progress was measured in price tags. When she opened the door, her face tightened for just a second before the polite smile appeared. Mom. What a surprise. I didn't bother with small talk. I came to talk. Not visit. Michael isn't home, she said quickly. Good, I said. This conversation is between us. She hesitated but moved aside. The air inside smelled of lavender and new paint. Every surface gleamed. She led me into the living room and gestured to the couch. I sat, keeping my purse close beside me. She perched across from me, legs crossed. That calm mask fixed in place. Would you like some coffee? No. Thank you. Patricia. We need to talk about this lawsuit. Her lips pressed together. There's nothing to discuss. You're not well. Mom. We've been over this. I'm not unwell. I'm grieving. But I'm not losing my mind. She exhaled through her nose, the way she used to when she was frustrated as a teenager. Mom. You called me last week, asking how to transfer money. Then you asked me how to pay a bill online. These aren't normal mistakes. They are when you're pretending. I said. Her brow furrowed. Pretending, what pretending to be helpless? She blinked. Processing. Then laughed. That doesn't make sense. Why would you do that? Because people talk differently when they think you're weak. They tell you what they really think. Her laugh came sharper this time. Mom. You're 68. What kind of threat could you possibly be? I smiled. The kind you'll find out about soon enough. She stared at me, the smile faltering. Mom. Please. You're scaring me. You should be scared. Patricia. Not of me, but of what you've done. She looked down, her hands twisting together in her lap. I didn't want to do this, she said softly. Michael thought it was the only way. And you always do what Michael thinks, I said. That made her flinch. He's trying to help. He knows business. He knows how to ruin one, I said before I could stop myself. Her head snapped up. What's that supposed to mean? Nothing you need to worry about yet. She leaned forward, her voice rising. Stop talking in riddles. I stood and picked up my purse. Patricia, I know you think you're doing what's right. But this isn't about helping me. This is about control. That's not true, she said, her eyes wet. It is. You're so afraid of losing what you think you deserve that you've convinced yourself I'm incapable. But you're not fighting me. You're fighting the version of me you created in your head. She stood too, voice trembling. Mom, I can't let you throw everything away. You already did, I said quietly. The moment you took my name to court. Her face crumpled. Please. Just let Michael handle things. Tell Michael, I said good luck. I replied, and walked toward the door. As I reached for the handle, I heard her whisper to herself. Half prayer, half curse. She's going to embarrass herself in front of everyone. I turned. The hallway light caught her face. Pale and strained. Maybe. But embarrassment fades. Regret doesn't. The look she gave me then was something between confusion and fear. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Outside, the wind had picked up. I tightened my coat and walked back to the car. The sky opened just as I reached the driveway. A steady drizzle that soaked the air. I sat behind the wheel for a minute, watching the rain hit the windshield in streaks. Through the front window, I saw Patricia pacing. She looked smaller than I remembered. Maybe guilt does that to people. By the time I got home, it was dark. I left my wet coat by the door and went straight to the study. The red folder was still on the desk, next to my notes. I opened it and stared at the copies of Michael's forged contracts. The financial transfers, the email from Sarah Kim. Proof of everything. I didn't feel satisfaction, just a steady calm. The next morning, Helen stopped by again. You look like you didn't sleep, she said, setting down a box of muffins. I met with Patricia, and she's more lost than angry now. But she's still standing on the wrong side. Helen frowned. You still planning to face them alone? Of course. That's the only way they'll learn who they're dealing with. Helen sat across from me, studying my face. You know, most people your age would be scared out of their minds. I've been scared before, I said. It's not new. I just learned how to hide it. She smiled, shaking her head. You're terrifying when you get like this. I know. After she left, I spent the rest of the day organizing my exhibits, labeling everything in order. The sound of paper sliding into folders was oddly satisfying. Every document was a small piece of armor. Late in the afternoon, the phone rang again. It was Michael. His voice was calm. Almost too calm. Mrs. Hayes. I just wanted to call personally and tell you we're not trying to hurt you. I waited. There was always a but. But this hearing isn't necessary. If you let Patricia and me manage things, we can make this easy. I'm sure you could, I said. Easy for whom? For everyone. We all want what's best. And what's best for you? Michael A. Pause. Stability. For Patricia. For the company. Stability built on lies doesn't last. He laughed softly. The kind of laugh that doesn't reach the eyes. You know, everyone's worried about you. People think you've lost perspective. I hung up. There was nothing left to say. That night, I stood by the window, looking at the city lights across the river. I could see my reflection faintly in the glass. For a long time, I didn't recognize that woman, the quiet wife, the grieving widow, the mother they thought was losing her mind. But underneath that, the old Eleanor still lived. The one who used to walk into courtrooms without flinching. The one who understood that silence, when timed right, could be louder than any argument. The phone buzzed again. This time, a message from Margaret. Hearing confirmed for Monday at 10. She didn't say anything else. But she didn't need to. I turned off the lamp and let the room go dark. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like a victim. They thought this was about inheritance. They were wrong. It was about respect. And in 2 days, they were going to learn the difference. Monday morning arrived gray and damp. The kind of Boston morning that made the city feel smaller and meaner than usual. I stood in front of the mirror, fastening the buttons on my navy dress. It wasn't new, but it was clean and pressed. And that was enough. My shoes were sensible. Low heels that had seen plenty of years but never betrayed me. I didn't wear jewelry, except for my wedding ring. Let them think I was plain. I wanted them comfortable in their arrogance. I left the house early, carrying my old leather handbag. It held exactly what I needed: a copy of Richard's will, my legal license, and a few documents Michael would have preferred never to see again. The courthouse was already busy when I arrived. Lawyers in dark suits moved like schools of fish through the hallways, trailing the scent of coffee and ambition. When I stepped into courtroom 3, Patricia and Michael were already there with their lawyer, James Morrison. He was the type I'd seen 100 times before. A man who believed the volume of his voice could replace the weight of his argument. Patricia looked polished, her hair pulled tight, her expression calm but cold. Michael's suit was expensive, but his eyes flickered the way guilty men's eyes do when they're not sure how much someone else knows. Morrison spotted me and gave a quick, dismissive smile. "Mrs. Hayes. Good morning. I see you're representing yourself today." "That's right," I said. He nodded as if humoring a child. "Very brave." I walked past him without replying and took my seat at the defense table. My handbag rested neatly on the surface beside a legal pad. Across the aisle, Patricia whispered something to Michael, and he smirked. I let them. The bailiff called for order, and everyone stood as Judge O'Connor entered. She didn't look at me immediately, but her gaze lingered an extra second when she did. She took her seat, shuffled a few papers, and said, "Counsel, you may begin." Morrison rose with practiced confidence. "Your Honor, this is a straightforward case. We are here because Mrs. Hayes, a 68-year-old widow, has displayed repeated signs of cognitive decline following her husband's death. These behaviors have placed her financial stability and family assets at risk." He spoke for nearly 10 minutes, his words smooth and rehearsed. He described me as forgetful, confused, unable to manage my own affairs. He called Patricia a concerned daughter, driven by love and worry. I almost admired his performance. He was careful to sound compassionate, as if this were an act of mercy rather than greed. When he finished, the judge turned to me. "Mrs. Hayes, do you have a statement?" I stood slowly, aware of every eye in the room. "Yes, Your Honor, I do." The silence stretched. I could hear the faint hum of the air vents. I began calmly. "My daughter believes I am unfit to manage my life." "I disagree." Morrison interrupted before I could continue. "Your Honor, Mrs. Hayes lacks the legal training to fully understand these proceedings." Judge O'Connor raised a hand. "Mr. Morrison, let her speak." "Thank you, Your Honor," I said. "I understand these proceedings perfectly. I've spent most of my adult life reading documents like these, though my daughter never cared enough to ask how." Patricia shifted in her seat. Her composure wavered. Morrison smiled tightly. "Mrs. Hayes, perhaps you can explain to the court how you became familiar with such matters." "Certainly," I said. "I was married to a businessman for 40 years. You learn things when you pay attention." A faint laugh rippled through the courtroom, quickly silenced by the judge's glare. Morrison continued. "Let the record show that Mrs. Henry Parents Hayes admits her knowledge is informal. We will demonstrate her declining ability to manage finances through testimony." Judge O'Connor made a note and looked at me again. "Mrs. Hayes, Do you understand that this hearing will determine your competency to handle your estate? I met her gaze. Yes, Your Honor. And do you wish to contest these allegations? I do. Morrison turned to Patricia. We'd like to call our first witness. Mrs. Patricia Miller. Patricia walked to the stand, her heels clicking across the floor. She looked composed, but her hands trembled slightly when she took the oath. Morrison began softly. Mrs. Miller, could you describe your mother's behavior after your father's passing? Patricia's voice wavered. She was different, forgetful. She'd call me multiple times asking about the same things. She got lost, driving to my house. She asked my son to help her with the TV. Morrison nodded sympathetically. Did these incidents concern you? Of course. I love my mother, but I was afraid she was being taken advantage of. I sat still, eyes on her. She couldn't quite meet my gaze. When Morrison finished, I rose for cross-examination. Mrs. Miller, you say I got lost driving to your house. Do you recall there being construction on your street that month? She hesitated. I think so. So it wasn't that I forgot where you lived, was it? It was that the usual road was closed. Her lips pressed together. I suppose that's true. And when I asked your son to help me with the television, it was because you bought me a smart TV that didn't come with instructions. Correct. A few quiet laughs slipped from the back of the courtroom. Patricia's cheeks flushed pink. Yes. I smiled faintly. No further questions. Morrison looked irritated. He moved to call his next witness. Michael. But before he could, the judge held up her hand. Mr. Morrison, I'd like to clarify something. You've presented examples of forgetfulness and difficulty with technology, but no medical evidence of cognitive decline. Do you have any? Morrison cleared his throat. Not at this time. Your Honor. The judge nodded slowly. Continue. Michael took the stand next. Confident, almost smug. He described how I'd refused his help with financial matters, how I'd been secretive about my late husband's business. When it was my turn, I asked, Mr. Miller, what is your professional background? I'm an investment consultant. I see. So you're familiar with managing other people's money? Yes. And would you say you've always done so successfully? He hesitated, just long enough. Of course. I smiled. Good to know. No further questions. Morrison frowned. Your Honor, I must object. Mrs. Hayes is badgering the witness. Judge O'Connor leaned back. I didn't hear a question worth objecting to. Overruled. I returned to my seat and waited. When the testimonies ended, Morrison moved for an immediate evaluation. He argued that I was clearly incapable of understanding the complexity of my own estate. That was when I decided to stop pretending. Your Honor, may I address the court? The judge nodded. Proceed. I reached into my handbag, pulled out a small leather wallet, and laid it on the table. Inside was my Massachusetts Bar Association card. Current. Valid. Issued in my name. I slid it forward. Your Honor, I've been an attorney since 1982. I specialized in criminal defense and corporate law until I retired to raise my daughter. My husband didn't handle the legal affairs of his company. I did. The courtroom went utterly still. Patricia's mouth fell open. Michael went pale. Morrison's pen froze mid-air. Judge O'Connor picked up the card, her face carefully neutral. Mrs. Hayes, why didn't you disclose this earlier? Because I wanted to see how far they'd go, assuming I was ignorant. I said. Morrison found his voice. Your Honor, this changes nothing. Mrs. Hayes hasn't practiced in decades. The judge raised an eyebrow. Perhaps. But she seems to understand the law better than anyone else here. The tension in the room thickened. I looked at Patricia. She was staring at me like she didn't recognize the woman sitting across the aisle. I turned back to the judge. I assure the court, I am fully competent. both legally and mentally. And I have evidence that may shed light on my daughter and son-in-law's motives. The judge's tone softened. Measured. We'll review that in due course. Mrs. Hayes. For now. We'll adjourn until this afternoon. She struck the gavel. Everyone stood. As I gathered my papers, I felt their eyes on me. Morrison whispered furiously to Michael. Patricia sat motionless, face pale and eyes wide. I walked toward the exit without looking back. My heels clicked on the marble floor. A sound that felt like the echo of a younger version of myself returning to life. Outside the courtroom doors, I exhaled slowly. The rain had stopped. The clouds were breaking just enough to let a thin slice of sunlight fall through the glass ceiling onto the courthouse floor. It felt almost like a sign. By the time I stepped outside, the air felt lighter, almost sweet after the heaviness of the courtroom. I walked slowly down the courthouse steps, letting the sound of my shoes steady my thoughts. The first round was over, but the real fight hadn't even started. I stopped at the corner cafe across the street, the same one Margaret and I had met in weeks earlier. I ordered tea, found a quiet table by the window, and let the noise of the city fade into the background. My reflection in the glass looked calm, composed, maybe even a little dangerous. I could still hear Patricia's voice from the stand, trembling as she tried to paint me as fragile. The memory almost made me laugh. My phone buzzed. It was a message from Helen. You made the news. Small piece on the courthouse blog. They're calling it Widow Turns Tables in Competency Case. You okay? I typed back. Better than okay. I finished my tea and returned to the courthouse just before the afternoon session. Morrison was already there, whispering with Michael. Patricia sat quietly this time, avoiding my gaze. The bravado she'd walked in with that morning had vanished. I recognized the look on her face. It was the same one I used to see on young lawyers the moment they realized the case wasn't going their way. When the judge entered, we all stood. She wasted no time. Mrs. Hayes, you indicated earlier that you have additional evidence relevant to this matter. Yes, Your Honor. Please present it. I reached into my bag and pulled out the red folder. The paper made a crisp sound as I laid it on the table. These are financial documents from Miller Investments. They show a pattern of misappropriation of funds by my son-in-law, Michael Miller, dating back 2 years. I also have an email from a former employee, Sarah Kim, confirming her knowledge of these activities. Morrison immediately stood. Your Honor, this is irrelevant to the question of Mrs. A. Hayes's competency. On the contrary, I said, these documents demonstrate motive. My daughter and her husband have a clear financial interest in removing me from control of my assets. The judge motioned for the bailiff to collect the folder. She flipped through the papers carefully. The room was so quiet, I could hear the soft scrape of pages. Mr. Morrison, she said after a moment. Are you aware of these documents? He cleared his throat. No, Your Honor. But I question their authenticity. Judge O'Connor raised an eyebrow. You'll have the opportunity to review them. But at first glance, they appear legitimate. Mrs. Hayes, you may continue. Thank you. Your Honor, I'd also like to submit a transcript of a conversation recorded at my home 3 weeks ago. It includes statements by both Patricia and Michael, discussing plans to declare me incompetent in order to gain control of my estate. Patricia gasped. Michael's face turned a shade paler. Morrison nearly shouted. Objection. Your Honor, that recording violates privacy laws. Actually, Your Honor, Massachusetts is a one-party consent state. I said. The conversation took place in my living room with my knowledge and consent. The judge nodded. That is correct. The objection is overruled. Proceed. I handed over the transcript. The clerk brought copies to each table. The silence that followed was electric. Patricia sat frozen, staring at the papers, her hand trembling slightly. Michael leaned toward Morrison, whispering furiously. The lawyer's face flushed red. After a long pause, the judge spoke. "I'll take a short recess to review this." When she left, the courtroom erupted in low murmurs. Reporters scribbled notes. Morrison turned on Patricia and Michael, his voice low but sharp. "What did you two do?" I sat quietly, sipping water. There was nothing left for me to say. The evidence spoke louder than anything I could add. Patricia's voice broke the tension. "Mom, how could you record us? You came into my house planning to take everything I had." I said evenly, "I just wanted to make sure I remembered your words correctly." She looked down, blinking hard. When court resumed, the judge's face was unreadable. "I've reviewed the submitted materials. The recording is clear, and the financial documents are substantial. Mr. Morrison, unless you have contrary evidence, I see no grounds to question Mrs. Hayes's competency." Morrison sputtered. "Your Honor, these materials could have been fabricated." The judge's tone cooled. "Do you have evidence of that?" "No, Your Honor." "But then sit down. Mr. Morrison." Patricia's shoulders slumped. Michael clenched his jaw but said nothing. The judge turned back to me. "Mrs. Hayes, your composure and presentation today demonstrate exceptional clarity. I see no indication of mental decline. Furthermore, it appears your family's actions were financially motivated." She paused, then added quietly, "I'm sorry this happened to you." "Thank you, Your Honor," I said softly. When she struck the gavel, the sound felt final, heavy with meaning. Petition denied. Case dismissed. For a moment, no one moved. Then it all unraveled at once. Reporters rushed toward the front. Morrison gathered his papers with shaking hands. Patricia stood, eyes glassy, whispering to Michael. He didn't respond. I took my time packing my things. My hands were steady, deliberate. I turned to Margaret as I finished. "Thank you for your fairness." She gave a faint nod. "You didn't need my help, Eleanor. You just needed to remind yourself who you are." I smiled. Maybe so. Outside the courtroom, the hallway buzzed with noise. Patricia hurried after me, tears already on her face. "Mom, wait, please." I stopped. "I didn't know Michael was doing those things," she said, her voice breaking. "I just wanted to protect what was ours." "Ours," I repeated quietly. "That's the problem. Patricia, you've never understood the difference between inheritance and entitlement." She flinched like I'd struck her. I sighed. "I don't hate you, Patricia, but respect is earned, not demanded. And you've spent too many years mistaking one for the other." She nodded weakly, unable to meet my eyes. Michael was standing by the far wall, already on his phone, no doubt calling a lawyer of his own. I turned and walked away, down the marble steps and out into the cool afternoon air. The sun had finally broken through, glinting off the wet pavement. At the bottom of the steps, Helen waited, holding 2 cups of coffee. She smiled when she saw me. "I figured you might need this." "You figured right." We stood there for a moment in comfortable silence. Then she said, "Well, you certainly gave them a show." "I didn't mean to. I just told the truth. Sometimes that's the best revenge." She said, "Maybe." I said, "But it never feels as sweet as people think." We walked together toward the street, the city humming around us. I felt lighter, not victorious, just free. The kind of freedom that comes when you stop apologizing for surviving. Across the square, a photographer snapped a picture. "Somewhere tomorrow." My face would appear in a headline again. "Widow wins against greedy family." Maybe people would read it with a smile. Maybe they'd see a bit of themselves in it. But I didn't care about the headlines. All I cared about was the quiet inside me. It had been gone for a long time. And now, finally, it was back. That night, the house was quiet in a way that felt foreign. No ringing phones. No voices arguing through walls. No papers spread across the table demanding my attention. Just stillness. I stood by the window, watching the lights shimmer across the Charles River. The city looked almost peaceful again, like it had been waiting for me to stop fighting long enough to notice it. The kettle whistled softly from the kitchen. I poured myself tea and sat down at the table. The same one where this whole nightmare had begun. The stack of folders was gone. The desk cleared. For months, those papers had been my armor. Now I didn't need them anymore. What I needed was to remember what life had felt like before the war started. Halfway through my tea, the phone rang. I let it go once. Twice. Then answered. Patricia's voice came through. Small and raw. Mom. I didn't say anything right away. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry, she said, for all of it. I leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes. The sound of her voice was the same as when she was 10. When she'd call me from a friend's house to say she wanted to come home early. I know, I said quietly. You don't have to forgive me. I just needed to tell you that. Forgiveness isn't the problem, Patricia. It's trust. That takes time. She sniffled. Michael's gone. Gone where he left this morning. Took his things. Some of the money, too. I guess he didn't like the idea of being married to someone who lost a case. I didn't respond. There wasn't anything worth saying. I don't know what to do now, she said, her voice breaking. Start over, I said. You've got a chance to rebuild. Don't waste it. There was silence on the other end. Then a soft, thank you before the line went dead. I sat there a long time, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator. For the first time since the trial began, I felt a strange kind of relief. The anger that had kept me standing all these months was fading, leaving something gentler behind. The next morning, I met Helen for breakfast at the diner on Cambridge Street. She waved as I walked in, holding up a newspaper. You've gone viral, she said, sliding it across the table. On the front page was my photo outside the courthouse. Hair slightly windblown. Holding my bag. The headline read, Widow outsmarts family in legal battle. You'd think they'd come up with something less dramatic, I said. Helen laughed. They love a story where the underdog wins. I stirred my coffee, watching the cream swirl. I don't feel like I won. Of course you don't. You lost a lot along the way, but you took your dignity back. That counts for something. I smiled faintly. Maybe that's enough. Helen leaned in. So what now? Going back to law? I shook my head. I think I've had enough courtrooms for one lifetime. Then I looked out the window. The morning sun caught the frost on the cars, turning it silver. Maybe something that matters more. She studied me for a moment. Like what I don't know yet, but I'll figure it out. Later that week, I drove to the cemetery where Richard was buried. The air was cold and clean, the ground still damp from rain. I brought a single white rose. Just one. He'd always hated the big flower arrangements people sent after funerals, said they looked like apologies that came too late. I brushed the leaves from his headstone and sat down beside it. I did it, I told him. They didn't win. The wind rustled through the trees. Somewhere nearby, a bird called out, sharp and quick. You were right about them, I said. About Michael. About everything. But you were wrong about one thing. I wasn't as weak as they thought. The sun broke through the clouds just then. Soft and pale. I let the silence stretch between us. When I finally stood, I felt lighter, like I'd left something behind that didn't belong to me anymore. On my way back to the car, my phone buzzed again. A message from Margaret. You handled yourself beautifully. If you ever get bored, The Bar Association could use a few guest mentors for young attorneys. I smiled. Maybe. That night, I sat by the fire with Helen, sipping wine, while the city outside grew quiet again. She was flipping through her tablet when she said, "You know, a woman online is collecting stories from seniors who've been through financial abuse cases. She wants to make a documentary." I raised an eyebrow. That sounds depressing. Not really, Helen said. She's trying to show that older women aren't victims. They're survivors. She asked if I knew anyone who might fit the profile. I laughed softly. I suppose I do. When she left, I stayed by the fire a while longer, listening to the faint crackle of the logs. My mind wandered to the years ahead. Blank pages, waiting to be written. For so long, my life had been about being someone's wife, someone's mother. Now, for the first time, it was just about being me. The next morning, I called Margaret back. "You mentioned mentoring," I said. "I did. Still interested, yes. I think it's time." She sounded pleased. "We could use your experience. These new lawyers need someone who remembers what the law is supposed to stand for." I smiled. "Justice. Not convenience." "Exactly." When we hung up, I felt something stir inside me. A flicker of purpose. It wasn't the old fire of courtroom battles. It was steadier. Quieter. But it was enough. A few days later, a letter arrived from Patricia. The handwriting was careful, almost childlike. She didn't ask for forgiveness this time. She just wrote about taking a new job, finding a small apartment, and trying to be better. At the end, she'd written, "I hope someday you'll let me visit." I folded the letter and placed it in Richard's desk drawer. Not yet, I thought. But maybe someday. Outside, the snow began to fall again. Soft and slow. The kind that doesn't stay long but changes everything it touches. I stood by the window watching it, feeling the quiet hum of peace fill the room. For the first time in a long time, there was no battle left to fight, and I was perfectly fine with that. The following week came quietly, like the city was catching its breath after too long holding it in. The snow had melted into thin, gray puddles, and the trees outside my window were bare against the pale sky. I found myself waking earlier each morning, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. For the first time in years, there was no case to prepare, no battle to brace for, just silence and the slow rhythm of ordinary life returning. I spent the mornings reading old novels, dusty law journals, anything that reminded me how much I used to love learning simply for the sake of it. Around noon, I'd walk to the market on Beacon Hill. The clerks had started recognizing me again. One of them, a boy named Nate, always insisted on carrying my bags to the door. I told him he didn't have to. But he'd grin and say, "My grandma would kill me if she knew I let you walk out with all that." It was a small kindness, but it mattered. That Saturday, Margaret called. Her voice was lighter than I'd heard in months. "We're putting together a panel at the university next month. Legal ethics and age discrimination. Would you be interested in joining us?" I hesitated. "I'm not sure I'm the right person for that anymore." She laughed softly. "You're exactly the right person. You lived it." I agreed, though a part of me still wondered what I had left to offer. When I hung up, I looked around my study. The room that had once been filled with tension and sleepless nights. Now it felt peaceful, almost warm. The red folder sat on the top shelf, tucked neatly away, a reminder of everything I'd survived. That afternoon, I drove out to see Helen. Her little house in Arlington was always full of noise, mostly her grandkids running wild through the living room. She was in the kitchen when I arrived, hair tied back, apron dusted with flour. "You look good," she said, handing me a cup of coffee. "I was starting to worry you'd retire from society entirely." "Retired?" Maybe. Reclusive. Never. I said. She smiled. But then her expression softened. Patricia called me yesterday. I paused. She called you. She wanted to make sure you were okay. Said she doesn't want to bother you directly. I stared into my coffee. That's considerate of her. Helen leaned against the counter. She's trying. You know. I nodded. But didn't answer. Trying didn't erase what she'd done. But maybe it was a start. Later, we sat on her porch as the sun went down. The air crisp and smelling faintly of wood smoke. You know, Helen said, people think revenge is about hurting someone back. But it's not. It's about getting back what they took from you. I looked out at the orange sky. Maybe you're right. She smiled. I usually am. When I got home, the answering machine light was blinking. Another message from Patricia. I pressed play but didn't speak. Mom. It's me again. I know you don't want to hear from me. But I wanted you to know I started volunteering at a legal aid center downtown. They help seniors with financial scams. It felt like something Dad would have wanted me to do. I guess it's something you'd want too. Anyway. I hope you're well. The message ended. I sat for a long moment, staring at the phone. Then I hit save. That night, I opened the old box of family photos I hadn't touched since Richard died. The pictures were faded, edges curled. But the memories felt sharp. There was one of Patricia as a child, sitting on Richard's shoulders, her tiny hands gripping his hair while she laughed. I traced the outline of her smile with my finger. Somewhere, between then and now, we had both lost sight of each other. The next morning, I went into the city for the first meeting of the mentorship program. The law building smelled of chalk and coffee, just like it used to. Margaret met me in the hallway, beaming. You ready? I smiled. Let's find out. The classroom was filled with young faces, bright and uncertain. When Margaret introduced me, a few of them actually clapped. I felt something shift in my chest. That old, familiar spark of confidence returning. I spoke about the importance of integrity. How law wasn't about power, but about purpose. One of the students, a girl with dark curls and sharp eyes, asked if I'd ever lost faith in justice. Many times, I said, but that's when you fight hardest to remember why it matters. Afterward, Margaret caught my arm as we left. You still have it, she said. Have what? That thing that makes people listen. I laughed. I think it's just age. People assume old women must know something worth hearing. She smiled. Sometimes they're right. Driving home, the radio played softly. An old jazz tune Richard used to hum while he cooked. For the first time, hearing it didn't hurt. It just felt like company. When I got home, the mailbox held another letter from Patricia. Inside was a photo of her standing in front of a small community center, smiling awkwardly, holding a clipboard. On the back she'd written, "Trying to make you proud." I placed the photo on the mantel beside the one of her as a child. They looked almost the same. Two versions of the same girl, trying to figure out where she belonged. As night settled, I lit a candle by the window and watched the city lights flicker across the river. The house was quiet again. But it wasn't the same kind of quiet as before. It was full of possibility this time. Not emptiness. I thought about all the women I'd met in that classroom. The way they'd looked at me with that mix of curiosity and hope. I thought about Patricia learning, maybe, for the first time, what it meant to help instead of take. And I thought about Richard, somewhere in the echo of memory, proud and amused that his stubborn wife had found her way back to herself. Before I went to bed, I turned off the lights and whispered softly into the dark, I'm still here. And I'm not done yet. The next few weeks unfolded in a kind of calm rhythm I hadn't felt in years. Each morning I woke to sunlight filtering through the curtains, the smell of coffee filling the kitchen, the small sound of the city stretching awake outside. My life was no longer built around defense or strategy. It was ordinary again. In the most beautiful way. I began volunteering twice a week at the legal aid office downtown. It was a modest space above a laundromat, always humming with voices and the faint smell of detergent from below. The first time I walked in, the receptionist, a young man with nervous eyes, handed me a stack of intake forms. "We're buried in cases," he said. "Most of them can't afford a lawyer." I smiled. "Then let's get to work." The clients were older. Most of them women. Most of them alone. They came in clutching envelopes of bills. Eviction notices. Loan papers they didn't understand. I listened to their stories, and every one of them sounded like an echo of my own. Betrayal doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes it comes from the people who know exactly how to hurt you. One afternoon, I met a woman named Marjorie. She reminded me of myself years ago. Her son had tricked her into signing over her property, promising to help manage it. Now he was selling it without her knowledge. She sat across from me, eyes down, voice shaking as she said, "I just wanted him to love me." I reached across the table, covering her hand with mine. "You can love your child and still protect yourself," I said. "Love isn't submission." She nodded slowly, as if the words were something she hadn't heard before but had always needed to. That evening, walking home through the city, I thought about Patricia. For years, I'd let guilt shape how I loved her. I'd mistaken sacrifice for affection, silence for patience. Maybe that was my fault as much as hers. The following weekend, I drove to her apartment. It was small, near South Boston, a far cry from the suburban mansion she used to flaunt. She answered the door, looking tired but softer, her eyes less guarded. "Mom," she said quietly, "I wasn't sure you'd come." I told her I wasn't sure either. She stepped aside to let me in. The place was neat but plain. A single couch, a small table, a half-finished jigsaw puzzle on the counter. She made coffee, her hands trembling slightly as she poured. I looked around. "You're doing all right here. It's different," she said. "But maybe that's what I needed." I nodded. Starting over isn't a punishment. Sometimes it's the only way forward. She sat across from me, her eyes filling. I keep replaying everything I said in court. I sounded like a stranger. "We all do things we regret when we're scared," I said. "Fear makes people cruel." She took a shaky breath. "I thought Michael would fix everything. But he broke more than he ever built." I studied her face. Older now. More fragile. But still the same girl who used to crawl into my lap after nightmares. I missed her. The version of her before pride took root. "Patricia," I said softly, "you don't have to keep apologizing. But if you want things to change, it has to start with honesty." She nodded, wiping her eyes. "I've been going to therapy. It's helping." "Good." We sat quietly for a long time, sipping coffee that had gone cold. Finally, she said, "Do you think Dad would forgive me? Your father loved you more than anyone. He'd want you to forgive yourself first." She smiled weakly. "I'm trying." When I left, the air outside was crisp, the first hint of spring in it. I walked to my car slowly, the city glowing faintly in the early dusk. Somewhere in that quiet, I realized I wasn't angry anymore. The sharp edges had softened. A week later, I received an envelope from the Bar Association. Inside was a formal letter appointing me as a mentor for new attorneys. At the bottom, in Margaret's neat handwriting, she'd written, "Told you they still need you." That made me laugh. The first class I mentored was a group of 5 young women. Bright, hungry, all of them juggling too much. They reminded me of who I used to be, before life demanded sacrifice after sacrifice. I told them the truth that most people avoid saying out loud. You can fight for justice and still lose yourself if you forget why you started. Protect your principles, not your pride. After class, one of them lingered behind. She looked nervous. Mrs. Hayes, how did you know when to walk away from the courtroom, when winning stopped feeling like purpose and started feeling like survival? I said. That night, I went home feeling lighter than I had in years. I sat by the window with a book and a glass of wine, the city lights glittering against the dark. I thought of Richard, of all the quiet nights we'd shared in this same room. Both of us reading, both content. I whispered into the empty space. I think I'm finally okay. The phone rang just then. It was Patricia again. But this time her voice was different. Stronger. Mom. I got accepted into a community college program. Social work. That's wonderful, I said. She laughed softly. I think I'm following in your footsteps. Helping people. I mean, I smiled. You'll be good at it. I hope so. Maybe someday we can do it together. Maybe someday, I said. After the call, I sat in the quiet again. The hum of the city, steady and kind. I thought about how life has a way of circling back. Not to where it began, but to where it should have been all along. Outside, the first stars were coming out. They looked faint against the city's glow. But they were there. Patient and constant. For the first time in a long time, I felt not like someone who had survived something, but like someone who had truly begun again. The past was still there, but it no longer defined the shape of my days. It was simply part of the story. And as I closed my eyes, I knew there was still one chapter left to live. Spring arrived quietly, without fanfare. The last traces of winter melted away, leaving the city washed and new. The park across the street bloomed with daffodils, their yellow petals stretching toward the morning sun. I started spending my mornings there, walking the same path every day, breathing in the damp earth and soft air. It felt like beginning again. On one of those walks, I saw Patricia sitting on a bench near the pond. She looked up when she noticed me, a little surprised but not nervous. She was dressed simply, hair pulled back, a book resting on her lap. For a moment, I just watched her. She looked at peace, older but lighter somehow. I walked over and sat beside her. She smiled. I was hoping I'd run into you. I thought you were working today, I said. I took the morning off. It's my day with the volunteer group. We're helping seniors with housing issues. I smiled. You've found your calling. Maybe I learned from the best. We sat in silence for a while, watching the ducks skim across the water. A group of children chased each other nearby, their laughter rising over the sound of the wind. Patricia glanced at me. I never thanked you. For what? For not giving up on me. I took a breath. There were so many things I could have said. So many memories tangled between us. But instead, I just reached for her hand. It's never too late to grow up. Patricia, you just did it the hard way. She laughed softly, eyes bright with unshed tears. I deserved that. You did, I said, squeezing her hand. But that's how we learn. After that morning, she started visiting more often. Sometimes we'd cook together. Sometimes we'd just sit and talk about small things, like recipes or the weather or the latest scandal in the local paper. The distance between us began to fade. One conversation at a time. One evening, she brought over a framed photo. It was of her and me, standing outside the courthouse after the hearing, taken by one of the reporters. She looked embarrassed, handing it to me. I thought you might want this. I took it carefully. The photo caught a strange moment between us. Both of us serious, but not angry. Both changed. I set it on the mantel beside Richard's picture. The three of us, in different times, together again. Later that week, I received a letter from Sarah Kim, the whistleblower from Michael's company. She'd started her own consulting business, helping small firms maintain ethical practices. She wrote to thank me for encouraging her to testify, saying it had changed her life. I folded the letter and tucked it into the same drawer that held Patricia's first apology. Some things were worth keeping. At the mentorship program, my students had begun calling me Miss Ellie instead of Mrs. Hayes. They said it felt more personal, more like family. One of them, a young woman named Dana, came to me after class. She was about to take her first big case, and she was terrified. "You'll be fine," I told her. "Just remember what matters. People first. Arguments second." She smiled nervously. "You make it sound easy." "It's not," I said. "But that's what makes it worth doing." That night, I stood by the window again, the city lights shimmering against the dark. For the first time, I didn't see loneliness in them. I saw life moving forward, endless and steady. A week later, Margaret hosted a small dinner to celebrate her retirement. She insisted on holding it at the same cafe where we'd met all those months ago. The place hadn't changed much, though we certainly had. "You're the reason I decided to retire," she said, laughing as we clinked glasses. "That doesn't sound flattering," I said. "No. It's the best compliment I can give. You reminded me why I started." We talked for hours. About old cases. About how life had turned out differently than either of us expected. As the evening ended, she squeezed my hand. "Promise me something." "Eleanor." "What's that?" "Keep teaching. There are too few voices like yours left." I promised her I would. When I left the cafe, the night air was warm, the city alive with music and motion. I stood for a moment on the sidewalk, watching people hurry past, faces lit by streetlights and possibility. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was looking back. I was simply standing still in the middle of life as it kept moving, and I was part of it again. The next morning, Patricia came over early. She brought muffins and a small envelope. Inside was a ticket to a fundraiser gala for the Legal Aid Center. She grinned shyly. "I wanted you to come as my guest. They're honoring the people who made a difference this year." I looked at her, surprised at. "Patricia, I don't need that kind of attention." "It's not about attention," she said. "It's about what you started." At the gala, the room was full of laughter and chatter. I watched from the back as Patricia took the stage, speaking about the importance of protecting those who can't fight for themselves. When she mentioned my name, the crowd clapped, and I felt something warm settle in my chest. Afterward, she hugged me tightly. "Dad would have loved this," she whispered. "He would have," I said. "He always believed in redemption." We walked outside together into the night, the city humming softly around us. The air smelled faintly of spring rain. Patricia linked her arm through mine. "Let's go home, Mom." As we walked, I realized how far we had come. Not just from the courtroom, but from the years of silence and distance that had separated us long before it. Forgiveness wasn't a single moment. It was 1,000 quiet choices made over time. When I got home, I stood for a while at the window, looking out at the water. The lights rippled across the surface like they were alive. I thought about everything that had happened, all the battles, all the loss, and how somehow it had led me here, to this peace that didn't need anyone's permission. I smiled to myself, whispering softly into the quiet. Some stories end in revenge. Mine ended in understanding. And maybe that's the best kind of victory there is. If you've listened all the way through, thank you for staying with me. Tell me, what would you have done if you were in my place? Would you have fought back? Or walked away? Share your thoughts. And don't forget to come back for the next story. There's always another lesson waiting to be told.